Welcome everyone to CSAC's weekly research seminar. My name is Harold Trinkunas. I'm the Deputy Director. It's a pleasure to welcome you this week to a talk by Dr. Veshla Weaver. She's the Bloomberg Distinguished Associate Professor of Political Science and Sociology at Johns Hopkins University. She was also a 2016-2017 Andrew Carnegie Fellow. She's co-author of Arresting Citizenship, The Democratic Consequences of American Crime Control, and also of Creating a New Racial Order, How Immigration, Multiracialism, Genomics, and the Young Can Remake Race in America. She's now at work on a new book, The State from Below, based on the largest archive of policing narratives developed using an innovative civic infrastructure called portals. She will be speaking to us today about this research in her talk, The State from Below, Racial Authoritarianism, Policing, and US Democracy. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Professor Veshla Weaver. And just as a reminder, we'll have a time for Q&A at the end, the last 15 minutes or so. Please go ahead and enter your questions at any time in the Q&A function in Zoom, and I'll go ahead and moderate the Q&A discussion when we get to that point. Without much further ado, over to you, Veshla.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Harold and Emily Silva, for having the vision for this event. I'll be drawing on new historical and contemporary work that my co-author Gwen Prowse and I are writing in a book called The State from Below. This is very much in process, and we are recovering, in some cases, lost archives of Black political thought. And so I'm very curious to hear your reactions. I am a Negro, 21 years old. On February 6th, 1962, when I was 19, I was walking with a young man down a Clarksdale street when Clarksdale police officers, and she names them, stopped us and accused me of having been involved in a theft. I was taken to jail by the officers and they forced me to unclothe and lie on my back. One of the officers beat me between my legs with a belt. A few minutes later, the other officer began to beat me across my naked breasts. The affidavit was signed by Bessie Turner in 1964. Clarksdale, the Mississippi Delta city to which she refers, is known for its blues music and the swell of activists that descended on it during what came to be known as Freedom Summer. Known too for its consummate racially authoritarian violence. Just a short drive from where young Emmett Till was lynched, and a generation before him, returning Black veteran L.B. Reed was hung from a bridge over the Sunflower River during the Red Summer of 1919 on suspicion of interracial romance. Clarksdale was and is part of a story of racial authoritarian violence. Turner joined over 250 other mostly Black Mississippians in 1964 who wrote their stories down at heightened danger to themselves, describing in detail the events leading up to an actual experience of state violence. Fannie Lou Hamer is within these pages, and she gives her testimony of being beaten in the Winona jail as part of a group of female activists. And young civil rights leaders, Andrew Young, Dorothy Cotton, and James Bevel, come to free them of the jail. There are others whose names aren't known, the editors unable to locate them, likely because they fled the state after their experiences. And there are still others who were not demonstrators, but tenant farmers and domestic servants who concealed their experiences of brutality because it was unremarkable in its time. Unlike the oral histories that make up most of our book, their descriptions were not initially meant to preserve a historical moment, but collected to seek federal injunction and relief to protect citizens from local government brutality. They were originally brought in a suit that sought temporary injunction against 3 notoriously authoritarian officers, those known and later convicted for aiding in the killing of civil rights workers. A sample of their accounts was published in 1965 in a buried volume called The Mississippi Black Paper. The introductory pages claim unspectacularly that democracy is used to authoritarian ends in Mississippi by local constables. Its political system has neither an independent judicial system or a democratic franchise, and its local sheriffs are capricious, sadistic, and unpunished for criminal acts. It compares Mississippi to Northern Rhodesia, South Africa, and Nazi Germany. Legalized injustice reigns. In the neatly compiled affidavits that follow one after the next, racially authoritarian governance emerges in full. They capture torture, including being beaten and held unclothed in a 9x12 windowless sweatbox underground and being hung by one's hands from cell doors for 30 hours. They capture extended campaigns of violent intimidation by police for not giving false testimony to aid the police after their murder of a local civilian. They capture police actively destroying property, opening fire on their cars, dragging people, decimating businesses, infiltrating church meetings, following people as they returned from voter registration drives, and trying to encourage local residents. And they capture resistance, simple acts like refusing an officer's demand for a yes, sir. They capture whites who fired their Black workers for being members of the NAACP after police instructed them to do so, being beaten and then refused a doctor, being arrested and held without trial date or explanation of charges, summary charges without legal representation or cross-examination, being beaten so ruthlessly that, quote, my nerve endings were permanently damaged. Black men who worked in the jail as janitors being forced to beat the women civil rights workers with a 2-foot blackjack or succumb to their own end, and being taken to the infamous prison farm Parchman to do hard labor. These affidavits cull from some of the worst abuses we have ever read, but they are not sensational or episodic or rare. As the writer Harding Carter remarks in the introduction to the collection, what happened in my state last summer was not the result of some extraordinary historical accident which found a vast assemblage of evil men in the wrong place at the wrong time. Racially authoritarian conditions prevailed because they had been there all along. Bessie Turner's very terse explication and recollection of being battered on one's breasts is joined by other acts of sexual violence and racial violence by official authorities across our loosely cumulated historical archive of first-person testimony, remaining decades after that summer in Clarksdale. It shows up as an officer calling out to a young teen enjoying a night out with friends, "Are you a prostitute?" It wends its way through the cavity searches and threats of cavity searches in Portal's narratives, which I will describe. The woman who mentions in passing that her firstborn was the product of an officer rape in Baltimore. The HIV positive woman with her medicine in her pocket told that if she informed on her dealer, the officer would not force her to give him oral sex. And it finds a girl waiting for her bus to carry her to church in Texas. 30 years before Bessie Turner takes a stroll through city streets, young Ferdy Walker stands alone at her bus stop. Ferdy Louise Walker bit her tongue until the end of the interview, discussing it only as the interview draws to a close. She described her life growing up on the east side of Fort Worth, Texas, the side of town where the more blue-collar population lived, the daughter of a public school nurse and a dining car waiter for the Texas Public Railroad. And she says this after detailing the course of her life. She calls up one final memory, deciding to commit the experience to record decades after having concealed it from her own mother. And her husband, Archie Walker, occasionally jets in. At that time, I was 11 years old, and I will never forget it. I used to go back and forth to church on Sunday afternoons to the United Methodist Youth Group, and I always rode the bus. And you had to stand on the corner, which was about 2 blocks from my house, to catch the bus. And the policemen in those days, all police people were white, and all bus drivers were white. Archie Walker, all city employees were white. Yeah, all city employees. And these policemen would harass me as I was standing on this corner waiting for the bus to come. And sometimes the two of them would drive up. You know, the bus stop was up high and the street was down low. And they'd drive up under there and they'd expose themselves. And the interviewer says, "Who, the policeman?" Yes, while I was standing there, and it just really scared me to death. And the only reason I did not go home at that time was because if I had gone home, my mother would have made me stay. So I just stepped back from the corner, but it was these same cops. So I had a morbid fear of policemen all of my life, and it has not completely gone away. And this was in the broad open daylight with the sun shining, but I will never forget it. And it always comes back to me every time I get into a really tight experience. That was really bad. And it was bad for all Black girls, you know. And her husband says, that's one of the things that parents passed on to their children, fear and hate of the police. If you look at the Black kids today, even the little ones, they are scared to death of policemen. And it's beginning to let up a little bit. The police are trying to erase that, but it's generations and generations and generations of fear. And she goes on to talk about how she has trouble thinking of the police as helping people. And when she goes on to become a public health nurse in Topeka, Kansas, she's unable to bring herself to call police when she witnesses domestic or child abuse, instead recoursing to a local minister or civic leader for help. Just as it did in decades past, policing in the 21st century constructs Black women's citizenship and girlhood, underwrites their safety deprivation, and sometimes exposes them to savage violence. It's difficult to condense the experiences from the women in our contemporaneous archive into a single portrait. They depict how effortful it was for young Black women to avoid police sight, their labors as mothers to protect their children, their bodies invaded through regular police procedures like cavity searches, degrading questions hurled at them, and not being treated or able to claim protection from serious victimization, because when they called police, they ended up being treated as suspects. And just as Bessie Turner and Ferdy Walker experienced sometimes sexualized terror or propositioning. They speak of having too little power to object to treatment or being taken seriously, and they summarize routine humiliation. This is an excerpt from a conversation in our Portals narrative, and I'll describe the Portals project in a bit. And the person, the Baltimore woman says, there are a lot, yes, there's a lot of racist cops, but the male cops are supposed to call females to search another female. Well, I had an incident where I was surrounded by 8 male cops and they were touching me and they weren't supposed to be. Yeah, that's what they were all taking turns doing. Her Milwaukee interlocutor says, that was in prison? No, that was out when they pulled me up. Oh, wow, what did you say when they did that? I asked them to stop. Then, lawsuit for that, I went to court. It was my word against theirs. It was 8 of them. Wow, my word against theirs, nothing I could do. To be Black in America is to live under an authoritarian state. There is no racial authoritarianism without police. There is no Jim Crow without police. There is no Northern segregation without police. And there is no Black resistance or freedom struggle without police. Yet somehow our fields have mischaracterized this relationship across time and place. Police are central to the construction and maintenance of racial authoritarianism, but many scholars in our fields have treated them as a sideshow to power, state authority, democracy, and state-citizen relations. So we constructed the largest known archive of policing narratives. We wanted to build a bottom-up conception of American democracy, a theory of the state from below. To do so, we trace the ways that state coercion and policing have played a perpetual, albeit evolving, role in the Black experience of citizenship. We draw from a number of sources from the Black counterpublic collected throughout the 20th century, connecting and reading policing narratives today through a subaltern canon dating back to the first Reconstruction. From the first prison memoir by a Black man in 1858, Austin Reed, born free but taken to the House of Refuge at age 6, to the narratives of ex-slaves collected in the Federal Writers Project during the Great Depression, to the Kerner Commission field interviews, to the oral histories of Black Americans who lived through Jim Crow in the 1930s and 40s, to the oral history collections of local rebellions from Detroit, Watts, Newark, Milwaukee, Baltimore, Crown Heights, and others, to the Mississippi Black paper accounts of police brutality, to John Gwaltney's collection in Dry Longso in 1980, to memoirs, Black historical newspapers, as well as newsletters and interviews from grassroots activists, to the writings of Black people in the American Prison Writing Archive in the 21st century, putting together a cumulated set of sources that were not part of one oral history data collection or narrative collection, but that together represent a substantial range of Black counterpublic critiques of American democracy via interactions with the state's second face. Together, these represent easily hundreds of thousands of pages of oral history first-person witness testimony. So when people say, aren't these just stories? We now have an incredible evidence base across generations, spatial contexts, and time. By doing so, we're illustrating how race-class subjugated people have always done the work of exposing United States democracy's contradictions and deficits, and have always posed some of the most incisive critiques and prescriptions for repair and reconciliation. The state from below seeks to provide one especially important concept, racial authoritarianism, and it seeks to do so by turning to the primary evidence base, which is located in race-class subjugated communities, by building an infrastructure that you see here that counters the architecture of inequality and isolation. Because when we turn to their theorization and deliberations and core critiques and rebuttals to conventional understandings of democratic equality and fairness and justice, by listening to a subjugated theory of the state, we can arrive at uncommon insights about American democracy itself and a new vision of what is possible. They understand what democracy is as it actually occurs better than those who set out its structures and formal rules. They understand its limits. They understand and are central witnesses to its uneasy relationship to authoritarian control. Yet the state violence and structural violence described here were paired with what we call epistemic violence, a discounting of their knowledge by mainstream academics and policymakers who wrote, theorized, and designed policy from the perspective of those for whom domination was not a core concern. We discovered that the bedrock and hallmarks of democracy, equality, rule of law, freedom to speak and assemble and be left alone, bore such little resemblance to what was being described in Portal's narratives that we needed to re-theorize the state. We needed to re-theorize governance, which is how we arrived at this racially authoritarian concept. We go directly to the sources and sites of police occupation, necessary to a broader understanding of racial oppression in the afterlives of slavery and Jim Crow. We demonstrate how Black oppositional discourse has always posed a rejoinder to prominent democratic frameworks, forcefully calling attention to conditions that did not fit within those frameworks. We show through accounts within the Black counterpublic how police were a chosen tool of political repression, particularly at the state and local levels. And through historical echoes, we can better see that the narrations of racial authoritarianism are tethered to historical Black thought and experience in theoretically consistent ways, and that repression often occurred and was extended through democratic justifications and processes. Once we did this historical and contemporary mapping, we were struck by just how enduring and similar and consistent the experience of racially authoritarian governance has been, how contemporary stories borrow from the past, even as they have complexity and have some departures. How does state coercion and authoritarian policing play a perpetual and evolving role in the experience of citizenship in race-class subjugated communities? How have the structures of racially authoritarian governance defined Black life worlds, communities, and together constructed ideologies? How ought we understand the connections between state responses to Black suffering and claims for state protection from the twinned issues of both safety deprivation and state violence? And what do we learn when we look to the collective efforts to provide protection and resist police repression across historical and spatial contexts? How ought we study and document repressive and coercive institutions and practices within nominally democratic regimes and collective efforts to secure Black and Brown liberation? Today, I want to introduce you to a civic infrastructure that we used to collect these discourses, these political discourses and narratives. And it's meant to connect and amplify voice and build power, not just as a medium for collecting discourses and narratives. And we're pairing this public method with the oral histories since about 1930 to trace the experience of racial authoritarian governance. We argue methodologically that having subjugated knowledge is crucial for our theorization of democracy, especially if it contradicts public wisdom. Understanding and theorizing government and state action and state power requires examining its actual operation in real communities. By listening to how the broader political community conceive of the democratic state's practices and its relations to citizens, not by focusing on what these institutions are meant to do in their formal embodiments, but what they actually do in communities and through the institutions that command the most authority in their lives, we will understand democratic citizenship better. Now, we're not the first to argue that subjugated knowledge should form the basis of our analysis of democratic life. This is, going back to Foucault and bell hooks and Jim Scott and David Graeber and others. But this hasn't been a central mode of study within our field. So to arrive at strong descriptive inference, then, it's necessary to disrupt traditional research methods and use a method that listens to political ideas and aspirations in order to build this ground-up conception of political life. When we use a listening framework, we see not only complex policy ideas, but we see theories of democracy. The method also isn't just about hearing democracy from the ground up. We're facilitating democratic deliberation. By introducing this public and civic infrastructure, we're addressing both democratic problems, surveillance being one of the only public things left, as Bonnie Honig argues, and the absence of spaces to deliberate, as those like Eric Kleinenberg argues. Think of it as a public square of the unfree. I will describe in more detail the portals. I'm not going to get too into the sample and the site locations and the neighborhoods and the political and police regimes therein. I want to instead introduce you by showing a short video that will show you what I mean when I say public and counter-public civic infrastructure, right? That we're using it not just to collect and extract narrative, but to build a space for Black freedom discourse and freedom projects. And you'll see this in the video.
There's a lot of police brutality out here. There's a lot of racial profiling, and it's the top of the discussion everywhere I go.
We promised ourselves as young Black folks in Ferguson, everything we see, feel, breathe here, I'm taking it home.
It's how we're starting a global community with the world, putting differences aside. This is our way of killing stereotypes. This is also our way of giving people the truth about culture.
Daniel Harris Pickett, Amir Rice, Antoine Shorter, Alton Sterling, Philando Castile. Verily, verily, the Spirit says to me, don't look away.
So you can see that the method is pretty much unlike anything that we scholars have to date. We plopped these gold shipping containers in areas of high foot traffic, mainly but not exclusively in areas of high levels of police intervention. And we partnered with community groups who saw it as a benefit. The designer of the portals has a vast network operating across the world in 48 sites in 15 countries in every continent except for Antarctica. And 150,000 conversations were taking place every year. Instead of isolation from others, this space is designed to connect. It's designed for deliberation. And over the course of the next year and a half, my colleagues collected 2,000 people's stories who exchanged experiences, sometimes homespun lyrics, sometimes poetry, bearing witness to one another, and shared their political aspirations inside these virtual chambers. We located the portal in 14 neighborhoods in 5 cities: Milwaukee, Chicago, Newark, Baltimore, and Los Angeles. Is that 5? Milwaukee, Chicago, Baltimore, Los Angeles, as well as one in Mexico City. And you can see, and I won't go into it too much, but when a person comes inside, they're connected by life-size video to another person in a paired city that they don't know. And we don't ask anything else of them except to briefly tell us, a little bit about themselves and their policing interactions. And then they engage in a 20-minute unscripted, unmediated conversation with a random stranger, though not totally random, right? These are people that tend to come from similar kinds of neighborhoods. Sometimes they're longer than 20 minutes. I can take questions about the method and the sample and sort of, what we found about the demographic representation. But the important point here is that portals are providing this kind of intentional place for everyday, unscripted political dialogue that is, participant directed, not researcher directed, allowing them to define what concepts and topics are meaningful in a community-driven setting characterized by equality, reciprocity, and unity of purpose, run and informed by the goals and needs of communities themselves. And because we're linking people across cities who would not otherwise encounter one another, the stakes of the exchanges are lowered and don't hinge on past expectations or future interactions. But a shared position provides foundation for deep and yet casual engagement. It's hard to really characterize everything that happened in the portal. People worked out a gang truce in the portal. They connected with countries all over the world. They learned about the Gagaka courts in Kigali. They brought activist networks together within the United States. In other words, they're not simply a nifty tool for gathering important data. They're a public good where they sit that enhances we think, the civic significance and connections of race-class subjugated communities. I'm just going to, fly through this. Part of what I think we're capturing is, it's not like a typical social survey, right? We're not trying to be representative. And we think the trade-off is that we are able to get in-depth stories about people's experiences and connect different pairings of people together, different cities together, different political moments. So we can hear how communities like the community where Sylvelle Smith was murdered, in the midst of that unrest, how they discussed police prior to, before, during, and after the unrest there. We can look at, Baltimore conversations before, during, and after the Gun Trace Task Force corruption case, right? Okay. Because I know we're on limited time, I wanted to sort of give a sense of what we have found, both in the portals and by mapping it and sort of tethering it to these older historical oral history accounts. What are the consistent components of racially authoritarian governance that emerge? What are the consistent political vocabularies being used? How do people understand their own citizenship? How do they understand political life? How do they resist, right? And today I probably won't get to all of them, but I wanted to discuss 5 core themes. The first is political socialization in childhood. This is a discussion in the Behind the Veil narratives, discussing 1930s and 1940s life in Memphis, Tennessee. And John Cooper says, they run us away from over there. That's when we found out what race really was then. On the weekends, we would go to Washington Park, and that was a colored park, as they used to call it. And then the young white fellas who went to L.C. Humes High School, which is right down the street from Manassas, would come over to that park and we'd play sandlot football against them until the police came by and saw it and broke it up. They'd come in there, they'd run the white kids out of the park and run us on back over toward the pool. Just didn't allow no mixing, Sometimes we'd be ahead when the police come and break it up. Sometimes they'd be ahead. So we'd always have to come back and do it again, until Mama got wind of it, that the police was breaking the games up and running the black youngsters with sticks. They would just talk to the white ones, but they'd try to hit you with a stick to get you out of the way, away from there. So after she found out what was going on, she'd say, I don't want you going back over there and playing no more ball with them white boys, That's just the way it was back then. And his conversation partner in the interview says, well, coming on up from that, when I was a little older and we get out on the street, the police run us off the corner if we were standing up just talking, They drive up and say, nigger, get off that corner, or boy, both of them was about the same. And they called old folks uncle and stuff like that. But that meant for you had to go if they tell you to move. And so we just got used to moving when they said move until I got about 15 or 16. And then I didn't want to move so quick. I was in high school, just getting in high school pretty good. And sometimes they come to run us off the corner and they'd go 1 block and turn around. Don't be on that corner when we get back. So we'd leave the corner and go on around and get behind some hedges. And when they come back, we'd brick them. We'd throw bricks at them, bust the windows out and take off. But that was our way of retaliating, So you can see how the experience of policing is happening in early adolescence and leads to a political socialization whereby they then start to resist, right? And start to not move so quick. These are the childhood political socializations from Portal's narratives. The first time police stopped me, I was 11 years old, and they stopped me because I was playing water balloon fights with my friends during the summer. And they handcuffed all of us. They paraded us in front of the community. They had the helicopter on us. And this was like a group of 11-year-olds, like nobody was older than 13. And like they had guns on us, like they pointed a gun to my head and they threatened our lives. Afterwards, even though we were kids, like the entire communities thought that we were up to something bad. But once you in a crowd, 4 to 5 people, y'all just walking, they're gonna roll the window down, ask y'all a question, probably pat you down. They wanna do all that just by walking down the street, coming home from school, still got book bags on. They'll just get out the car and bug up with you. They'll just start spazzing out of nowhere and then want us to say something, want us to say, go at them with lip so they could have a reason to grab that gun. I ain't even fitting to lie to you. That's how it worked. And then then a girl, talks about her experience as 13 years old. going to a cheer competition. Somebody says, when my son was 9 years old, he was beaten very badly by a police officer. My son was 86 pounds. When he tried to push past and go in the house, he lifted my son off the ground with his elbow, where his legs was dangling in a chokehold. So what I did, I went to the Big Brothers program and I looked for a police officer that was white to be my son's big brother, to show him that every officer is not like that. And finally, when I caught my first case, the police, when he was taking me into the county, he told me to watch his white shiny head. Watch the sunset on his white shiny head, you fucking nigger. And I was 16. One of the things, and I've been in these conversations around policing for quite some time now, that people don't quite realize is that most people who have a single police interaction often have their first encounter with police prior to the tender age of 14. Okay, the median age is 14. For Black youth, it's 10. And that this constructs a very early and memorable moment, what we call a state baptism, of the state responding with force and constructing one's Blackness. This is just to give you a sense of how many, that there was more. There was just as many kids stopped in New York by police as 25 to 30-year-olds. But perhaps most importantly, these early political socializations construct subjects, not democratic citizens, and it exposes youth to authoritarian relations with government. Youth end up taking up habits of aversion, declining to get medical treatment when they need it, detouring out of certain neighborhoods so as to avoid police contact, engaging in a wide range of habits, styles of dress, ways they wear their hair, ways that they speak, ways they comport themselves, ways they shift their stature, girls holding the book bags or offering to give boys that they're walking with their book bags so as to avoid police encounters. Police stops are dramatic occasions for political learning, where people receive negative lessons about how governing institutions operate and position them. They tend to cultivate distrust and racialized alienation from the state, eroding civic skills and engagement in political life. I'm not going to go through this because I want to have leave time for questions. Another major theme we find is what we're calling distorted responsiveness. It's not simply aggressive force and aggressive interventions into public space that people are experiencing. It's that there's two sides of the same coin. They're unprotected by police and law, but also subject to its capricious regulation. An experience which parallels Black communities in the United States in the past, experiencing this kind of what Monica Bell calls legal estrangement. One of the most common narratives, both in the oral histories and in Portal's narratives, is what we're calling distorted responsiveness. What we're seeing is both high levels of state abandonment alongside high levels of social control in the very same neighborhoods. They're both easy to abandon and abuse. Instead of responsive government agents, people experienced the state as both everywhere and nowhere. Police authority was most energetic where it didn't matter for their lives, busting people down for selling loose cigarettes or other minor transgressions, but withholding and systematically out of reach when they were steady dying. Aggressive patrolling was yoked with ambivalence. This meant participants saw the police as both useless and harmful, and they saw themselves as vulnerable to the state on both flanks, to abandonment and to aggressive intervention. Not being heard, not being cared for when you're a victim, not being taken seriously is a form of non-responsiveness and disregard by the state. It is painful in its own right, but being treated harshly in the company of perceived abandonment is what we mean by distorted responsiveness. And I'll just, these are the historical narratives, a few that I've put up here, where people described if they were victimized, there was no recourse, right? You couldn't go to the police, right? And here's one woman, after she experiences being robbed, she says, you call the police, they don't come out here. You call them, they don't pay you any attention, but that's Jim Crow to me. And the interviewer says, what do you mean? That I have to pay taxes to have police protection and I can't get it. And contrast that with a contemporary portals narrative. The police where I live at, they just take a long time to get there. Like you can call them for anything. It don't matter what it is. And they be talking like they don't got enough force out here to come and help you when you really need them. But they be harassing people who ain't got nothing, absolutely nothing. Yeah, they do shit when they ready to do it, when it's beneficial to them. They really don't give a fuck about how you is. I'll end with a description of our last theme. This isn't the last theme, but it's the one I'll end on. What we're calling misrecognition, right? It's not merely that people experience distorted responsiveness or aggressive policing, or that they don't have any recourse, or that they experience discrimination and bias. What they consistently described was an idea that the state flattens their identity, right? That the state didn't have a fulsome understanding of who they and their communities were, and instead came in with a kind of predefined script. So this is a woman in the Voices of Crown Heights oral history that was taken after the unrest in the early 90s around police violence there in New York, in Crown Heights, New York. But I don't feel like I can walk into my own apartment building now if there are police officers standing in front without feeling a certain level of scrutiny. Do I belong here? What am I doing here? How long am I staying there? And even if it's not meant with a certain hostility, it's still the fact that I have to be assessed in my own building, walking down the street that I, basically grew up on. It comes down to just the assumption of belonging, I guess. Like, I belong here. These are my streets. I know these streets. I know the history of these streets. I know what I want the future of these streets to be. I am invested in this community. I don't care if you mean good or ill. I'm not going to take kindly to some outsider coming in and telling me how things should go. And let's be clear, the police are outsiders. Like, by definition, they are not supposed to be policing the neighborhoods they live in. So how well do you know my hood? How well do you know the people of my hood? Talk to me, or look at us and judge who belongs and who doesn't. On what basis are you making your assumptions? And what are your assumptions about the people in the neighborhood? Because just because you assume that I belong here doesn't mean that you assume good things about me. Consistently, people described being misrecognized by the state, flattened, not understood, governed by a predefined script. Here's an older oral history, actually, of a man recounting his experience as a Black veteran in Macon, Georgia, on Daniels Field. And he says, there was a rash of bitter beatings of men in my company when they would go to Macon on pass. Without exception, every time the trucks would come back, there would be instances where my men would have been beaten by the local police and by the MPs. He's talking about Black soldiers. Although we protested to my commanding officer and the base commander, nothing was being done about it. I got to the point where I said, now listen, we've got to have a meeting. And he asks his commander for this meeting. The commander puts him off, holds the meeting at the very same time the men are supposed to have lunch, hoping that the men don't show up. They do show up. And he says, we marched up there for the meeting and we held it. The men made known their complaints and so on. Then I spoke, because while we were in that meeting and the doors to the hangar were open because planes had to come in, I heard this rustling at the door and turned around and looked at the open doors because we were facing the front, you see, and there was a semicircle of military police with their carbine rifles drawn, looking into our meeting. Now, these are American soldiers and we are American soldiers at the meeting. The men in there turned around and looked and saw these MPs with carbines drawn, trying to intimidate us. At that point, I was ready for my life to end. And I made a speech that I don't think I'll ever be able to make again. But I, at that time, spoke of the horrible war and the mistreatment of the American people, American soldiers, and the very idea right here in one of these rooms on an American base, men preparing for war, not knowing if they were going to survive. And here are MPs, also soldiers, pointing their guns at us, and passing by would be one MP military police sitting on the cab of a truck and a truckload of German prisoners. One of them just sitting there controlling a truckload of German prisoners. And here you had a whole platoon of MPs pointing their guns on fellow soldiers. I was removed from the base because I had too much power and they had to remove me. The base commander was removed, the base chaplain was removed, and my company commander was removed. They cleaned the base out because of that activity. This is a more extreme form of misrecognition, right? Literally being deprived of your soldierdom, right? Being rendered suspicious and expendable in the company of your fellow soldiers who seem to amplify your threat versus the threat of German soldiers. But we see it in other places as well. I don't know, let me see how much time I have. I think I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to read this, but suffice it to say that many of the collections, many of the testimonies we hear are from people who are describing not discrimination, not excessive treatment, but the condition of being misrecognized, right? Not understood in their community's full complexity by the state, and instead rendered something else. I'll skip through this, but continuities in the experience of state violence are very, very similar. People who describe being beaten in certain ways so as to not leave marks on their body. And then finally, the portal's narratives also push us toward a different understanding of individual and collective resistance, political responses and resistances. And you'll see here a few of these examples. The one I find most interesting is this one. Zechariah Alexander says, during the period of time when there was such cruelty in the lower South, when they uncovered the peon areas, those plantations down there, they had Blacks that were in prison on the plantations. Many Blacks escaped from those. See what they would do, okay, pretend I'm a farmer. I'd purchase the persons who were jailed, Black. I'd purchase their time and they would have to come and work for me for a certain number of years, work that time out. And many of them never got out of those plantations. When they tried to leave, they'd kill them and bury them. When the investigation began to open up and these things were found, many of those people escaped. Many times we have slept what we might call escapees from those camps in our funeral home on their way to different places. And those were things that very few Blacks knew about because we couldn't even trust Blacks. We had a lot of Uncle Toms, you know. We couldn't even trust Blacks to let us know what we were doing. He is describing the operation of an underground railroad occurring in the 1930s, right? Using a network of funeral homes to help convict lessees on prison plantations escape, right? Much like the Underground Railroad operated during slavery. I've hoped in this work to unsettle framings of American democracy and policing and to show from portals that we have a distorted portrait of democracy and government in America. These narratives help, I think, recast how we understand the role of the state in the lives of race-class subjugated Americans. Marginalization or unequal citizenship is not simply a story of material inequality, the distance between the haves and the have-nots, or the responsiveness of our political system to those that got and those that ain't. Instead, it is a broad difference in the way the government, from schools to the welfare system, and especially the police, orients itself towards residents in racially authoritarian ways. It's not only that people in communities like the low end in Milwaukee or south side of Chicago are exposed to a different set of material deficits concentrated in particular spaces that makes them vulnerable. Listening reveals that they characterize their relationship to government as one marked by distorted responsiveness, misrecognition, childhood socialization, flowing from a logic of institutionalized expendability. To make distinctions between a government that is registering preferences or not becomes besides the point once we consider the experience of race-class subjugated communities, where exclusion from formal politics and conventional institutions is not the main grievance. Instead, it is inclusion in racially authoritarian conditions and practices across the Black diaspora, across time, and generation. Even in disagreement and all their complexity, you will hear a theory of racialized class subjugation and authoritarian relations that extends and amends the theories of Frederick Douglass, Du Bois, and Martin Luther King, and James Baldwin. And then finally, I think we ought to rethink how we do our data collection. And I like to talk about the portals as a public good, as a place where people did all sorts of political imagining, where they described activities of coming together and redefining how the state should operate in their communities. We saw it, this immersive virtual environment, as a space for imagining the radical potential of civic dialogue and creativity. These spaces create new possibilities for civic life and the power to link to communities around the nation and thereby create a public square of the unfree, those most affected by state violence, predation, safety deprivation, to bear witness and collaborate on liberation projects. In our portal sites, bottom-led projects for justice have shifted political consciousness and activated political imagination. We harnessed a technology that could become a counter infrastructure to a state and to a media that so often compounded their group stigma and create connected political spaces out of disconnection. We're trying to build the practices and virtues of a better alternative world into the practice of social science research. In my case, using the research as a space to create meaningful political dialogue about policing in ways that embed the virtues of political equality and voice and a commitment to listening. I'll end there, and I would love to take your questions. And I can speak in Q&A about how this became a platform to build power and to collaborate and to enact a different Black political future. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Weaver, for that incredible talk and for sharing your research with us. I'm really grateful for that. And we have some time for Q&A now. So I'm going to go ahead and read some of the questions from participants in the seminar. I think I'll take the first one from Professor Gabrielle Hecht in the Stanford's History Department. I wish she was actually here to read this. She says, Vesla, I'm blown away by your talk and the bigger project you described. This would have been powerful under any conditions, all the more so as we track the trial in Minnesota. You have shown us very concretely the deep implication of systemic and epistemic racism. You're inviting us to consider citizenship and subjecthood, and thus the state and democracy, as differentiated and deeply embodied experiences and practices. You've shown us how crucial it is to break out of our stale molds and methods in order to make both political and epistemic progress. You show us the US is not a democratic state, but it's an authoritarian state, a radical act of deprovincialization. I kept thinking of Mamdani's class on politics in Africa, citizens and subject. Can you speak to how the portals that you've showed us outside the United States shape this picture?
Could you repeat show how portals outside?
Portals that you showed us outside the United States have shaped this picture. And I would just add, shaped your thinking about authoritarian policing the authoritarian state in the United States.
Yeah, you know, it's a great question, and I loved that introduction. You know, she really captured what we're really trying to do in the research. You know, for a long time, it just struck me as so curious that American politics scholars, you know, when it comes to policing in other contexts, you know, Beatriz Magaloni and Yanilda Gonzalez and Javier Ayero have shown us, right, and that's just the Latin American case. There are other places around the world, right, the policing of minoritized populations in virtually every country and context around the world shows strikingly similar logics and practices and habits and resistances. And we're seeing this now with the global resistance movement to policing. And yet, right, when Yanilda describes racially authoritarian conditions in her context, in Colombia, right, or Brazil, we sort of understand, oh, well, that was a past, repressive military regime. And of course, these, repressive practices carry over and become even more institutionalized under democratic processes. And yet, within the United States, we can't seem to use similar vocabularies. It becomes about, equalizing treatment among the police. It becomes not about state killings. It becomes about, sort of officer misconduct, right? And so it's always been really, I think, liberating for me to start to read the comparative work that's emerging now, because it gives us a crucial vocabulary that we have lacked, right? We have understood that in the United States, the biggest democratic grievance is really that, people don't participate equally in government, right? We got to equalize voting, right? Not that the state is more than just whether it responds to you or not, your preferences, right? Look at the lingo in American politics research. It's all about preferences and preference equality, and not in the main about how your government as frontline bureaucrats with a monopoly on political violence, right, inhabit your neighborhood, construct it as criminal, extract huge sums from it, right? And so I have felt myself drawing closer and closer to the comparative politics research, because I've felt myself so hamstrung and confined by this language of discrimination. And as long as we sort of train police to operate better, communities will feel secure and safe, right? And communities will feel unrepressed. And I think that that's just, if anything about this moment is showing us, it's that is not enough. It's that the entire system, the entire institution is predicated and has always been across time, right? Police began as slave patrols, right? In the repression of racialized populations. Now, to get to her specific question, I have not collected narratives. I'm in conversations with Janilda about doing the portals on like sort of a global scale. It would be a massive undertaking. I think my first step was really just to map the consistent experience of racial authoritarianism across the United States, across history. But I would like to, I think it's my next step, is to push for a more comparative accounting of the ways in which police construct citizenship and democracy in contexts all over the world.
Thank you for that. And in fact, Gabrielle also adds, I kept thinking of South Africa, both during apartheid, but also today. And we were having that conversation right before the talk started. So I think that's a fascinating next project, so to speak. Let me take a question now from Bill Phillips. He's one of our CSAC affiliates. He says, thank you for this presentation. I am Black. Your portal technique has captured generations of intuitive knowledge passed down within Black families and communities. My question is, how would you see this information being used to modulate policing or address policing now and in the future in race and class subjugated communities?
Oh, I love that question, and yet you just asked me the $1 million question. I'm going to give a sort of easy answer, and then I'm going to give a bigger answer. He's absolutely right that, experience with policing has been intrinsic to understandings of state power in the Black counterpublic. You see it everywhere in the writings and testimony and sermons and poetry of Audre Lorde, essays early on prior to civil rights. You see it in Black newspapers, before the rise of social media. And I would argue, and I don't think that this is controversial, but I don't think it's recognized, that much of Black political thought has developed out of the experience of police oppression. And police oppression was linked to all manner of other repressions. It was linked to the franchise, right? It was linked to how public space right, was constructed, right? How Black people were squeezed out of public space, how they were relegated to the ghetto, right? Police were everywhere in the writings and testimonies of Black thought leaders, and yet we do this weird thing as scholars. Like, even when we're researching the Black Panther Party, somehow in their original writings, right, if you look to Huey Newton, if you look to the writings of Eldridge Cleaver, if you look to Fred Hampton, right, and I hope everybody has seen the fabulous movie Judas and the Black Messiah, right? If you look to all of that testimony, it's about policing, right? First and foremost, it's not about, well, give us the right to be in your neighborhoods. It's about get your boot off my neck, right? It's about claiming bodily protection, which is why Black Lives Matter is such a resounding call that was said by Ida B. Wells, right? Generations before this moment in her, contest against lynching. So how does what I'm doing construct a policy response, construct how we ought to see? The small answer is, I think once we see that policing is about childhood racial socialization, the childhood construction of Black boys and girls, it becomes much harder to have the political will to continue that practice. It's one of the reasons why I'm trying to unearth the fact, little known in policy circles, that the first encounters youth, Black youth and brown youth in particular, have with the state is at the other end of a baton and at the other end of a pat down. I think it becomes much harder politically to justify a policy, right? The American Association of Pediatricians says we shouldn't spank children, and yet we regularly allow public officers of the state to use force against Black boys and girls who are prepubescent ages. So that's the narrow sort of move that I want to make is, and it's an abolitionist stance. There is no safety logic to allowing an armed officer of the state to have an encounter with an 11-year-old girl or boy, okay? The broader answer to that great question is, I think that once you hear the through lines of how state violence has been practiced on Black people and Black communities, it becomes harder and harder to see policing today as divorced from those earlier incarnations. So what I'm hoping to do is to release us as a scholarly community from this really a bizarre practice of hypothesizing policing encounters as being contemporaneous phenomenon that are divorced from patterned and institutionalized practices of state violence against racially minoritized populations. That's what I'm trying to do. Once you see that Ferdy Walker is Breonna Taylor, and that every single moment, every single movement to disrupt that relationship has not only not ended racialized state violence, it has actually secured it further and further and justified it further and further, right? Every single movement to challenge police power yielded what? And I hope this movement today does not do the same, does not repeat the past. It yielded greater and greater police budgets, power, authority, scope of authority, and intrusion into the fabric of communal life. So that's my bigger sort of like, it's not like an explicit policy change. It's more, once you see the broad mapping, much as, somebody studying authoritarian relations in another context, right? We would not talk about policing in South African apartheid as, well, we just need to sort of train officers, make it a little bit more equal, make sure they have some body cams. Once you link it to an institutionalized practice of governance, it becomes harder and harder to not take up an abolitionist stance.
Thank you. I was going to try to squeeze in one last question, but I know we're over time. Do you want to try to take one last one and then we'll wrap it up?
Sure.
Sure. So Paul Edwards, a colleague at CSAC, also directs the STS program here at Stanford, talks about, and he asked this question early on in the talk, the Mississippi Black Paper book that you referred to, and talked about, even though Reinhold Niebuhr and Houghton Carter, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing those names, wrote the forewords. These are clearly very well-known public intellectuals at the time. Yet you talk about the book as buried. And it seems to me, just building on that, you brought up this incredibly rich material from the 30s and 40s and earlier that you're basically bringing back to the present conversation. And if you could talk a little bit more about, in a sense, the process of burying those past and sort of maybe what can be avoided today with this new material that you're gathering with portals.
That is a terrific question, and I think it's something that Gwen and I, have struggled with mightily. Because I'm going to tell you a couple things. One, it was far less common to collect ordinary Black experiences, prior to, say, the rise of social surveys. Okay. These oral history collections are really few and far between. Sometimes we're finding them in unpublished dissertations. Sometimes we're finding them in, the Journal of Negro History from, the 1930s, right? In fact, this will be of interest to the political scientists out there. The very first journal issue of the National Conference of Black Political Scientists in early, I think it's 1971, was called the Journal of Political Repression. And its very first issue was around police violence and police repression. So we have been trying to sort of like scour and find like little pockets, first by reading the secondary literature, and then second by going to archives like the Schomburg. We found a lot of oral history accounts that tend to happen after moments of unrest. Sometimes, like Behind the Veil, is not necessarily about police at all. It was just sort of about life in the Jim Crow South. And so we've sort of mined that for any time somebody spoke of revenue agents, which tend to operate like police in the South. Anytime they talked about local sheriffs or courts, or the local constable, or door knockers, as they were called when they were Black, the paddle rollers in the Works Progress Administration. So it is lumpy, right? What we've collected is incredibly lumpy. There's missing years, there's missing regions, there's things that had, we wish we could go back and ask this person a little bit more about their story, right? And the Mississippi Black Paper is one of those, very strangely, even to get to the other 200 affidavits that weren't published, they are buried within a Mississippi archive that we had to sort of go searching for. And it didn't even necessarily say that it was in there. It's in a folder that, like, it didn't even say, it's a folder on the Council of Federated Organizations that was leading the organizing project in Freedom Summer, right? So it's been difficult as a social science researcher because we've sort of just acted like investigative diggers, and I'm sure historians are much better at this. When we tend to have Black counterpublic thought, it tends to be elites. And we're following what Saidiya Hartman talks about in Wayward Lives, which is what happens to the people whose stories weren't heard either because they died, right? Because they weren't seen as significant enough people to even collect their stories, right? And how does that distort even the oral histories we have, right? In Behind the Veil, right? Shirley Sherrod is in there, right? These are major figures. What happens to the people that are in the corners, the people whose lives were expendable, the people who didn't survive to tell their story? And so we methodologically are very clear to say this is a cumulated picture of the people that actually made it out, that were alive to tell their stories. And there's probably hundreds, thousands others that didn't have that chance, right? So
Thank you for that. We're completely out of time, but it's been a wonderful, wonderful conversation. Really, thank you for joining us today, Veshla, and everyone. Will be sharing the video on the events page so that others. So we've got some questions about whether they can rewatch this afterwards. So we'll make that available. But again, thank you so much for participating, and we really appreciate you sharing your research with us. It's absolutely fascinating.
Thank you so much, and I look forward to publishing the book. And please, if there's any questions that came in that I wasn't able to answer, I would love it, Harold, if you could send them my way. And thank you for the terrific questions I got.
Great. Yes, I will definitely do collect those. We had a couple more, so I'll send those to you. Thank you everyone for participating, and thank you again, Professor Weaver, for sharing your research.
Thank you, Harold. Take care.
You too.